Daniel received the prophecies from God, not knowing much of what he wrote. Much of it pertained to the tribulation period and the coming of Jesus Christ to earth to establish his kingdom as the King of the Jews, his everlasting kingdom. And when Daniel received the messages that were written to him, he asked, "What shall the end of these things be?" Or literally, "When shall these things be? When shall they come to pass?" In Daniel 12:8. The disciples of Jesus, after he had gone to the cross and was dead and laid in the grave, and after he was resurrected from the dead, and he taught them for 40 days beyond his resurrection, before he was taken up into heaven, just before he ascended into heaven on the cloud, in Acts 1:6, his disciples asked him, "Lord, will thou at this time restore again the kingdom to Israel?" They were interested in him establishing the kingdom, and since he had all the preparatory work done and out of the way, that is, he taught them, he raised up a following, he was crucified, went into the grave, and resurrected from the dead. So therefore, they understood the two pictures of Messiah in the Old Testament. Now, hitherto no one understood it. They were given a picture of two Messiahs. John the Baptist didn't understand it either, and sent to Jesus through his disciples and asked, "Are you the one who is coming, or do we look for another?" That is, another of a different kind. And Jesus said, "Go tell John the things you've seen and heard, and he'll understand it." And he understood it. His disciples did not understand it until his resurrection from the dead. They thought there might be one Messiah who came to suffer and another who came to reign. Jesus turned out to be both of them. And they couldn't understand how one who would suffer and die could then reign forever. Well, now they understand it, and so they said, "Will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" And Jesus gave them an answer which we won't look at right now. We'll look at that in a few minutes. Matthew records in chapter 24 and verse 3, "And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives," that is, Jesus teaching his disciples, "the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" They were looking for a sign of when the things that Jesus was teaching were about to take place. And what will be the sign of your coming? That is, your return. And of the end of, literally, the end of the age. When will the end of the age come to be? In Luke 21:7, the same question is recorded, little different form. Luke doesn't record it in its fullest sense, but the implication of the question is still there. Lord, when? Then we go down to Mark, and in chapter 13 and verse 4, Mark inquires, "And what shall be the sign when these things shall be fulfilled?" Throughout all the Old Testament and the New Testament, and throughout the entire church age, the question has been when. And even though the Lord pinpoints some specific timing concerning many of the events that we have seen from history that have come before, he still never puts a day and an hour and a year or even a century to when his return to the earth will be. Now, these things pertain to Jesus' return to the earth to establish his millennial kingdom, and then coming from that, his everlasting kingdom upon earth. There is absolutely no language in the New Testament that even tries to predict the time of the rapture. There are no signs whatsoever that point to the rapture, no matter what some of these know-it-all theologians who come on the radio, whose only claim to fame happens to be they have enough money to purchase radio time or have an article printed in a newspaper. No matter what they might tell us, the Bible is absolutely devoid of any such language. There are no signs that point to the rapture, because the rapture is itself a sign. It is a sign to the world that the tribulation period is now upon it. A sign which the world at that time probably will not be able to read. There are no signs that tell us that Jesus Christ is going to come today at 6 o'clock or at midnight or last week or next year. Nothing. The earnest expectation throughout the whole church age, and in the first century especially, is that Jesus Christ will come in the next moment. That before I've had opportunity to draw the next breath, Jesus Christ will return for me. But since people still want to put dates and hours to things, it is incumbent upon us to look at the evidence in the New Testament and then to think about the implications that it has upon us now. And then what should be the result? What should every Christian do in the face of the evidence? And so Jesus in Luke 21 again patiently draws out the picture for his disciples. Now you can read this in Matthew 24 in a little expanded version, or a smaller, more minuscule version in Mark 13. It's the same account. Or you can, if you really want to see an expanded version of it, go back to the book of Revelation, and it covers chapters 6 through 19. That is the events, or those are the events of the tribulation hour upon the world, and especially upon Israel. Now, in Luke 21, Matthew 24, and Mark 13, we have a distinctively Jewish flavor to the account, because Jesus is in Israel, he's in Palestine, and in fact he's in the capital city of Jerusalem. He is speaking to Jews pertaining Jewish history about to come upon the scene, about the Jewish temple, about the Jewish kingdom. And in fact, we know that it will be a worldwide kingdom. And the elect that he speaks about in Matthew 24 is the elect of Israel, those of faith in Israel. Remember, when we come to the New Testament, there are two elect companies. Israel has been the elect of God all through the Old Testament, all through the New Testament. That has never changed. God has never rescinded it. He has never made that void. Israel is still the apple of his eye. Israel is still looking for the kingdom to come. The Bible still promises an everlasting kingdom to Israel. And the heir through David will sit upon the seat, possibly David himself, over the kingdom of Israel. But there is also in that kingdom the promise to the church, those who through Jesus Christ have come to faith after the cross. That is, the Gentiles who put their faith in Jesus Christ, and the Jews who put their faith in Jesus Christ after his resurrection from the dead. That's the church. That's the second elect company. And all through the New Testament and all through the book of Revelation, there is a parallel strain going all the way through of two elect companies, and each inherits specific and special blessings. Now, in dealing with chapter 21 of the book of Luke, Jesus says that there are some things that must come to take place, some things that will happen before Jesus himself can return to the earth to set up the earthly kingdom. And we're going to talk about the earthly kingdom first and then evaluate the rapture in light of the earthly kingdom. Now, the first thing he says is that in the first century some things will be taking place in the land of Israel and upon the earth. And those are covered between verses 12 and 19. It is necessary that Jesus speak to his disciples, and those things which would be pertinent to them most immediately, and then go from there to the next stage, He begins where he is. It's one thing that I like about Jesus, the way he deals with people, is he begins where they are and moves out from there. He's going to begin where they are in Jerusalem. And in verse 12 he says, "But before all these they shall lay hands on you." Now that is before all of these events that he has just enumerated, and we'll look at those in a minute. Before these things take place, they shall lay hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogue and into the prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, and it shall turn to you for a testimony. Jesus says, first of all, before any of these things take place, I'm going away now, but after I go away, you'll be my representatives on earth. And as you are my representatives, the world is not going to welcome your message any more than it welcomed mine. The Jews will not welcome your preaching of the gospel and preaching my name any more than they welcome me preaching the kingdom to come and using my own name, addressing myself as the Son of God, and they will not receive you addressing me as the Son of God. And in fact, they will throw you out of the synagogues thinking they're doing God a favor, eliminating cultists from the established religion, from the established practice of the synagogues. And they will deliver you unto the prisons. Now, we don't know anything like that in this day. People are not delivered out of the church today and into the prisons. But there was a free course to do that in the first century, and in fact in many centuries hence. I was reading an account yesterday under a bibliographical study where when the King James Bible, one of the variants that was put into it after 1701 was the fact that they put into it Ussher's chronology of time, starting with the creation of 404 BC and then coming on using Bishop Ussher's chronology. And the other thing that they did was they omitted, and from the sound of what I read, it sounds like it was more incidental than purposeful, but they omitted the Old Testament apocryphal books from any place within the binding of the Bible. And the Bishop of Canterbury, being very much disfavored with that, had the editors of the New King James Bible of his time thrown into prison. You see, it was known throughout different centuries, even in what we would consider modern times historically. But we don't know about it today. But Jesus said in that day they would be thrown out of the synagogues and cast into prison, and being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. And all through the book of Acts, the history account of the church, we have those things taking place. Paul was brought before Herod Agrippa in order that he might recount his story before the king, and that he might try to win favor with the king. And then he came before Caesar and gave his account again before the Caesar of his day. They were brought before kings and rulers, Jesus said, for my name's sake, and it shall turn to you for a testimony. But you know, this does happen in a limited form even today. There have been those who for biblical reasons have drawn themselves away from the general thought of society for good, legitimate, valid, biblical reasons, and have found themselves imprisoned for the cause of Jesus Christ. Now, what else did he say? Well, he said in verse 16, "And ye shall be betrayed both of parents and brethren and kinsfolk and friends, and some of you shall they cause to be put to death. For the preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for those who have been convinced of the truth of the gospel and have latched onto it, and it has become part of the fiber of their being, many of them would be betrayed of parents and brethren and kinsfolk, relatives and friends, and be thrown into prison, and many put to death because of the preaching of Jesus Christ. That's the first century. Many of us may have suffered rejection from family and friends and even neighbors and loved ones because of our stand for the gospel of Jesus Christ, but more so in that day. And he says in verse 17, "And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake." Now we understand that in New Testament times. You may even understand that on a more personal basis. You may have suffered rejection from people in the community or the community at large in some community because you stood for Jesus Christ and they did not. If you've ever served in the armed forces and were a Christian at that time, you would understand the implication of verse 17 in a very severe form. If you were a child in school, and just about any school throughout the nation today, you would understand the implications of verse 17. If you stand for Jesus Christ and they do not, you would understand what it is to be hated of all men for my name's sake. And they truly were. And were delivered to the councils, and were delivered to the kings, and to the prisons, and to the cross, and to the stoning pits, and all the rest for the preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Jesus said, these things must come to be first before I can come back. But there shall not be a hair of your head to perish, that is, before the appointed time, until they have completed their course. Simon Peter in Acts 5 was beaten and turned loose. And there were others throughout the entire book of Acts. They were threatened and beaten and given stripes, that is, whipped with a cat of nine tails, which many times, by the way, disemboweled its victims. And they were turned loose. Why? Because not one hair of their head could perish until they had accomplished what Jesus appointed them to do. And then every one of them, with the exception of John, was martyred. Every one of them suffered a martyr's death. Now, he says in verse 19, in your patience possess ye your souls. That is, your patience will mark the self-control that you are exercising over your being and over your expectation and over the things which you are suffering until I come. We are to be patient, he says, and especially those in the first century, because these things would not mark the end. The end is not yet. Now that's the first century. Now the second part is this. After the first century events took place, there were some further political events of interest. Now turn back with me again to verse 5 and verse 6 in Luke 21. And this is actually the beginning of this particular context, but I put it in the middle because this is one of those secondary events that takes place. Verse 5, and as some, that is his disciples, as some of his disciples spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, as for these things which ye behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now Jesus here speaks in prophecy concerning the events, the political events, the geopolitical events, the geographical and political things that will take place beyond the point where he now stands at approximately 33 or 34 AD. And he begins with the most recent or the most current event and then pushes it outward toward eternity or toward the future to come. And he speaks of an event or several events here that take place beginning in AD 70, 35 to 40 years later from the time he is now speaking. And Jesus said, look at the temple. You have just spoken about it, how greatly it is adorned and how beautiful it is with the goodly stones and the gifts and everything. It's a beautiful place. It's inlaid with gold on the inside in the holy place, and it has some of the most beautiful furnishings that could be put into it. It took 40 years to build it under the ascendancy of the Herods. It is called Herod's Temple. It is in no way, shape, or form as beautiful or as large as Solomon's Temple, which preceded it, and of course was sacked at an earlier time. But this was still a beautiful, ornate, and beautifully adorned temple. And the precious stones were not only beautiful, they were worth a king's ransom. And Jesus said, look at these things. Yes, you're right, they are indeed beautiful, but I tell you that before I will come again, that this temple will no longer exist. There will not be one stone left upon another of this temple, and all of the gold and the furnishings and the ornate stones and the gifts that make up the treasury of the temple, and those beautiful objects of silver and of gold that are the instruments that are used of the priests in the temple worship, they won't exist. They'll be carried away. And in fact, if that isn't devastating enough to the Jewish mind, Jerusalem, the capital of Israel since the time of David, nearly 1,000 years, will no longer stand. It'll be sacked and pillaged and destroyed, and everything that we know that pertains to this beautiful, holy city will have been desecrated and decimated. Look at verse 20. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies. Now, he is not speaking here of the Roman legions, which now occupy, as an occupation army, the streets of Jerusalem. He is talking about, because of the uprising of the zealots, making Rome very offended and upset, and coming against the land to take and seize final and complete control upon the entire land of Israel, especially beginning in Jerusalem, under the command of Titus, a general of the Roman army, a commander of the Roman army, who comes in and actually pillages Jerusalem, sacks it, that is, steals everything that is worth anything, and levels the city. But that isn't all. Disperses the people to every nation of the world as it was known then, particularly the outlying areas surrounding Israel, the closest ones in, and then many were taken in slavery and exported by the Roman soldiers. Now, he said in verse 20 that Jerusalem will be compassed with armies. Then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. He goes on to describe the situation in verses 21 to 24 in more hopeless terms for Jewish people. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that gave suck in those days. For there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. Now, there are two things happening here. When Jerusalem was sacked and pillaged, and the temple that he spoke of in verses 5 and 6 were leveled, the Roman general Titus leveled the city, or much of it. He destroyed the temple, and in fact it says that they burned the furnishings. History tells us they burned the furnishings and made the fire so hot that they actually melted down the gold that had been laid on top of the stones as an inner surface, in order that they might melt all the gold off and take the whole thing with them into their treasury. They so devastated the temple that they even melted the gold that was inlaid upon the walls, so that they could take every bit of a spoil that they could possibly get with them. Now, also, this speaks of a time which is to come. This speaks of a time during the tribulation period where Jerusalem will again be sacked and destroyed, only this time more completely so. This speaks of a time of devastation which is now described as vengeance upon the people. Not only the time when the people were despaired and carried into captivity and fled from before the armies of Rome, but were actually carried to the slave markets of Egypt by the thousands in order to work in the mines in the first century. But this is a time also in the tribulation hour, a time of vengeance, a time because of the faithlessness of God's people that God is visiting wrath and vengeance upon the holy city, the nation of God, and throughout the entire world. No place to flee. It will be a time when those who are described as having the most difficult time under the best of circumstances, where it'll even be more difficult in that hour, this is a time of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Those things which are written, all those things that all the prophets had spoken about, all of the minor prophets had spoken about the destruction of Israel, the wrath of God that would rain upon Israel and upon the world. The book of Revelation speaks of it, all the Gospels speak of it, and all of the New Testament writings apart from the Gospels and the book of Revelation speak of it, and speak of the time of Jesus coming and of the day of Christ, or the day of the Lord, which is the tribulation hour. We who are Christians will not be present for that. Jesus said, before I can come again, though, to the earth to establish my kingdom, which is what they were interested in, all of these things must first come to take place. Now, look at verse 24, because there is something else extremely important in verse 24. In verse 24 it says, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now this is important for two reasons. Jesus said that Jerusalem would be trodden down until a time when the Gentiles would no longer be in control of the holy city. Now, the times of the Gentiles has not yet been fulfilled. Even though we do not find Jerusalem in this hour under Gentile domination, we find Jerusalem and all of Israel under Gentile dependency. We will find it again under Gentile domination under the Antichrist and the armies that will then infest the streets in the tribulation, until the time at which the Antichrist and all of the others will be dealt with and judged and cast out, and God will establish his kingdom. However, Jesus said before he can come again to the earth, the Gentiles will not be in charge of Jerusalem. The interesting thing is that many have postulated that before Jesus would come in the rapture to receive his saints, possibly Israel and Jerusalem may be in that condition where it is no longer under Gentile domination before he returns. Now, Israel has not been a nation for 2,500 years. Israel became a nation again in 1948. That was necessary before Jesus could come to the earth to establish his earthly kingdom. It happened May 14th, 1948. It had been in the process of happening for 30 years. Since the time of World War I, and in, don't think I have my year correct, but I'm going to take a stab at it, around 1918, when the Balfour Declaration was signed, and England again gave the right to Israel to establish a nation, which they did not in practice or effect carry out until 1948, when they were actually allowed to charter as a nation and stand as their own, and they elected a Knesset, a parliament, and they elected a president of the Knesset, David Ben-Gurion, and still Jesus could not come and establish his kingdom on the earth because they did not possess as the capital city Jerusalem. It wasn't until the July 6 Days War of 1967 when Israel captured back part of Jerusalem. Jesus said that Jerusalem would no longer be trodden down of the Gentiles when he returned in his kingdom, to establish his kingdom. In 1967, they took back part of Jerusalem. There had been a constant tug of war over that part of the city since. In 1980, in an unprecedented move, Israel made an act of aggression against its enemies and seized the entire city. Now, what do we have? As of 1980, Israel is now in Jewish hands. Jerusalem is now in Jewish hands entirely. There was even talk of moving the capital in 1980 from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It became possible as of 1980 for Jesus Christ to return to the earth to establish his kingdom. Are you aware of that? But the Bible testifies that Jesus will return to establish his kingdom at the end of the tribulation. And the rapture takes place at the beginning of the tribulation. Now, if it is absolutely possible for Jesus Christ to come to earth and establish his kingdom as of 1980, 8 years in the past, and we're going to disappear 7 years prior to that, how far can it be for the rapture to take place? However, that only signifies to it that it could be in the next moment, before we have opportunity to draw the next breath. That does not give us license or right to establish a day and an hour, not even a year. I saw a little booklet in a bookstore. It says 88 reasons why the rapture can happen in 1988. Well, I can give you 100. But that wouldn't fit with the year, see? Well, next year they'll probably have 189 reasons why the rapture could happen in 1989. And you could probably come up with 8,000. It could happen in 1988. It could happen in 1989. But we are not to set times and seasons and dates and watches and hours or moments, even to try to pick the year. Now, It's interesting to play little biblical mathematical games, but be advised they are only games. If it has not been disclosed in Holy Writ, it has not been disclosed. And you and I are not going to figure it out when the infinitely wise God saw it to his benefit not to disclose it. We need to live in the realization of the fact it could happen at any moment and be ready at any moment, not only to be carried off into the heavenlies, but to be ready and willing and operatively living for Jesus Christ and doing what he wants in this moment, if it should take place, so that he may find us faithful and working, doing his will in this moment, if he should come at this moment. Now, what should it lead us to do? Certainly not have the electricity turned off and the water turned off and sell the real estate and give away all your possessions and all that utter nonsense in hopes that you can get rid of all of this wealth before Jesus comes. That's ridiculous. The Bible doesn't expect us to do that. The Bible expects us to live in the living reality that the rapture could happen at the next moment, and then that should spur us not to all these ridiculous cultic expressions, but it should lead us to faithfully witness to those who are around us, so that when we go, they go. The object is to fill the kingdom, not to furnish the kingdom of Satan that'll be left behind. Not to furnish the houses and the living for those who are going to be unfortunate enough to remain when the rapture takes place. They have remained because they have chosen to remain for the most part. They will remain at a time when the whole earth will have had the gospel preached to it, and they will have rejected it. But we're not to rub their faces in it. We're to try to win them up to the moment that we're taken. And that's what God will bless. Now, there are some events in nature that'll take place, and we covered them when we went through the book of Revelation before Jesus Christ comes. And he's telling his first century listeners, verse 25, "And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing for fear, but looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken." Now, let's back up here. Why preach about the tribulation if we're expecting the rapture? Because I don't know the spiritual condition of everybody hearing this message. It is important, as Jesus thought it was, to delineate all of the things that will take place, or many of the things that will take place, highlighting certain events that will. Notice it says that these things which are coming on the earth. Not might, not maybe, but are coming on the earth in the tribulation period. It is essential that we realize that God is not playing games, and that God has given a gospel for people to be saved, and he has given the Word of God that we might find the manner of living that pleases God, and therein find joy in our daily life. And that we find joy in thinking about being caught up to be with him. And we should find joy in that, because everything will be perfect in that moment. And you and I will stand in perfected bodies if we belong to Jesus Christ. And there is no sickness and no death and no poverty. There is no corruption, and nothing enters into heaven that will defile. And those are reasonably joyful expectations that we possess as children of God if we have put our faith in Jesus Christ and we have been saved. But if we have not, then there are conditions coming upon the earth that nobody could relish, that nobody can derive any joy or any substantive expression for living or reason for living from. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken, not the powers of God, but the heavens, plural. Those spiritual powers in heavenly places. The kingdom of Satan will be put on its ear in that hour. The kingdoms of the earth will be under great stress during that hour. Nothing shall remain as it is. Men's hearts failing them for fear. Nations in perplexity. Well, what's so perplexing? You think the troubles we have on earth now are perplexing? You think that men have fear now? You try living in a period of time called the Great Tribulation hour, which never was since there was time, nor ever shall be again, according to Matthew 24. You try living in a time when a third of the sun is blotted out, and a third of the moon is blotted out, and a third of the stars suffer devastation. When a third of the seas and a third of the land are destroyed, and a third of the population of the earth is destroyed, and that's repeated more than once. When all of the fresh water turns bitter like wormwood. When all of the kingdoms and nations as we now know them have suffered defeat, and many of them annihilation. You try living in that hour and tell me that you will find the joy that your selfish, foolish human heart thinks it is going to derive for itself from the pleasures of this world and this life. And I'll tell you, you're fooling yourself. Now, Jesus said all of these things must transpire before I come and establish my kingdom on the earth. But the rapture of the saints, the rapture of believers. Now, rapture means to be caught up. And there are those skeptics and scoffers who tell us, well, you show me the rapture in the Bible. It doesn't exist. The word rapture, to be sure, nowhere appears in the Bible. You can read the New Testament from Matthew to Revelation, and you will not find the word rapture. Unless you're reading the Latin Vulgate, because it's a Latin word, and it came from the Latin Vulgate. It means to be caught up. Now, you will not find the word rapere in the New Testament, but you'll find it described. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel and the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Wherefore, comfort one another with these words. 1 Thessalonians 4:16-18. Revelation 3:10 talks about the time of the church and then the time of the rapture, and Revelation 4 begins to discuss the events of the earth without the church present. And in chapter 6 begins the discussion of the great tribulation hour. Because thou hast kept the word of my patience, I will keep thee out of the hour of tribulation, the hour of temptation, which is about to come upon the whole inhabited earth. Revelation 3:10. The Bible teaches us that those who believe in Jesus Christ, who have trusted him as Savior and Lord, will be caught up together, whether dead or alive. out of the grave or off the earth, into the presence of the Lord in the clouds, from whence, when the Lord returns to establish his kingdom, we come with him. Because he spoke in prophecy, saying that the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints. All who have trusted Jesus Christ from the point of Pentecost, or the point of the cross, to the last soul that will enter into his family at the moment of the rapture. Now, he said in verse 27, when all of these things have taken place that pertain to the first century and the last century, the tribulation, the last 7 years of earth history, then, verse 27, then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Not the last 7 years of earth history, but the last 7 years of earth history before he comes. Then shall they see the Son of Man in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, I'm not exactly sure what those who have died without Christ will know of that coming. But Jesus did tell Pilate that henceforth ye will see the Son of Man coming with the holy angels and in his glory. Interesting concept. You can think that one over. You can ponder that one for a while. But Jesus said, then shall the Son of Man come to earth in the clouds with power and great glory. Acts 1, he went up in the clouds, ascended to be with his Father. Luke 21:27, he descends to earth in the clouds upon the Mount of Olives. Zechariah 12. And it cleaves under his feet. And he establishes millennial kingdom, and then he establishes the white throne judgment, and then comes the everlasting kingdom, the kingdom of Jesus Christ, the eternal kingdom upon the new heaven and the new earth. And these things, verse 28, when these things begin to come to pass, sell all your possessions and get rid of your real estate and go sit on a hilltop and wait for me to come, right? No. Remember the movement in Kentucky about 15 years ago? That's what they did. Went up and sat on a hilltop waiting for Jesus to come. He didn't come. 1980 was a local radio station in the Washington area that had, and I guess he was on radio stations all over the country, or as much as he could afford. His name was Willie Dave Smith. And he would come on the radio every day, and he predicted that 10 o'clock a.m., April 1st, 1980, Jesus Christ is coming, the rapture will happen, and the saints will disappear. And he was on the radio clear on up until April 1st. At least he had enough sense not to be on the radio April 2nd. But you see, he was pushing his tapes and his books and his booklets and all the rest that could set from Old Testament prophecy exactly what watch Jesus would come in. By the way, he picked an interesting date for Jesus to return. There were a lot of April Fools that year, unfortunately. Many are deceived by such contradiction of Scripture. The Bible does not tell us that we have the right to set the date and the hour, or to set times for the rapture or the coming of Christ to the earth. Now he says, when you see these things begin to come to pass, then look up. Why? Because when these things begin to come to pass, we will see the world moving toward being set up for the tribulation period. And we're going to disappear 7 years before Jesus Christ comes to the earth to establish his kingdom. We're going to be gone at the moment the tribulation period begins. But there will no doubt be a movement which tends toward the establishment of the tribulation. And when we see these things, or the signs of these things beginning to take place, he says, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. We're going to disappear 7 years before he comes to the earth to establish his kingdom, if we're saved. Now, we're told in Acts 1:6 that they asked him, Lord, have you come at this time to establish the kingdom? In Acts 1:7, Jesus answered his disciples that it is none of their business. He says it's none of your concern what seasons and hours the Father has put in his own control, his own hand. In Matthew 24:36 it says, and of that day and of that hour knoweth no man, not the angels of heaven, but the Father only. And that is repeated also in in this book, Luke. In Mark 13:32, it says not only that, but it adds a phrase. It says, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. Now what does that tell you? Well, it tells me that at the time when Jesus walked on the earth, it was not necessary that Jesus know what day or hour, or allow himself humanly to know the day or the hour of his own return. Now we can get into some real sketchy theological problems if we push that hard enough, but it suffices it to say that. Can God be limited in his knowledge? Yes, and as far as it fits his pattern, God will limit himself to certain knowledge, and Jesus did that from time to time as he walked on the earth. Now you can well believe that at this moment he knows the day and hour of his return, but it was not necessary for the Jesus who walked with those disciples in that hour to know it. Therefore, in his limiting of his own knowledge, he limited his own godly power, he could limit his own godly knowledge. And as a man, he was not allowing himself to have that knowledge to pass on to his disciples. It is not for the Son at that moment to know it, but the Son knows it now. He knows when he's coming. He knows when he'll return. The question is, if the Son of God did not know in Mark 13, how in the world can a finite man set a day and an hour for the return of Jesus Christ, or for the rapture for that matter? If the day and the hour of the return of Christ to the earth couldn't be established, then the rapture can't be established. Now, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to live godly. We're supposed to witness freely. How do I know that? Because the rapture is in 1 Thessalonians 4, and that's the theme of 1 Thessalonians 5. Since the rapture is going to take place, then you who are going to be caught up in that blessed moment, in that wonderful event, then live for Jesus Christ now. Take every moment that is available and live for him. Don't go sit on some hilltop and wait. Don't go sit on the roof and wait. Don't go around telling people you know the day and the hour he's coming. You go around tell people that there is impending doom coming on the earth. And there is. It's called the tribulation. And Jesus is coming first to take those who belong to him away into the heavens. And you testify to them the gospel of Jesus Christ, and you witness to them so that they might put their trust in Jesus and be saved and be caught up together with you. That's the blessedness of that moment. Not just to escape this world and its responsibilities, but to escape the devastation that is going to come upon this world. Now, Father, thank you for your word. Thank you that it instructs us and that it gives us so completely the plan of the future that we may rest assured that if we know Jesus Christ, we'll not be present, and so completely that those who don't know Jesus Christ can make a decision for him, knowing the things that will transpire on the earth. And yet it is sketchy enough not to give us the freedom to set days and hours, which would tend to make us lazy when it comes to the effecting of the gospel of Jesus Christ to a lost and dead world. Father, place in our hearts the conviction and the knowledge that Jesus Christ will come soon, maybe momentarily, perhaps even today. Father, then allow that conviction to so work in our hearts and in our lives that it would cause us to bring people to the kingdom, to gather before your feet.